My Saturdays were spent taking a ride up the road and handing out flyers that say Al Gore for president in big bold letters in front of a local church in Windsor, North Carolina. Most people would smile and take my early artistic creations without question. Think about it, having a 5-year-old with a gap-toothed smile handing out campaign flyers is actually a really good campaign strategy. So after exiting the church, one man took my flyer, shook my hand, and asked me, why should we vote for Al Gore? What has he done for our people? I nodded to acknowledge this question and matter-of-factly stated, I'll get right back to you. I then scurried over to my mother, interrupted our conversation, and whispered in her ear, Mom, what has Al Gore done for our people? She smiled and took over the conversation with the man from there. I don't remember much of what she said, but I do know that he responded with phrases like, I won't accept halfway, and neither one is better than the other. I watched intently as they had this conversation over my head and wondered what this man meant, right? So before walking away without a flyer, he bent down to me and said, always remember to ask questions. Things are never as simple as they may seem. Now, at 5 years old, I didn't quite understand where his advice was coming from, but I did know that I should consistently be asking questions. I grew up surrounded by family members that were engaged in movement work their whole lives. They questioned the world to a point where it seemed like they were almost dissatisfied with everything. I carried this critical engagement with me in everything that I did. So, growing up in community organizing work, I consistently questioned why I felt so out of place. So in high school, gay-straight alliances, they didn't really speak to my experiences with gender. In animal and land rights spaces, they always felt too white. And in racial justice spaces, they always felt too masculine. I grew up tossing and turning throughout movement spaces and never really quite feeling the right fit. I didn't fit into conventional molds of respectability enough to fight for justice for Eric Garner, who was murdered in Staten Island. I didn't fit into conventional black masculinity enough to fight for justice for Mike Brown, murdered in Ferguson, Missouri. I didn't fit into conventional molds of transness to fight for Ilan Nettles, murdered in New York City. I just never seemed to fit, and this would be a common narrative of my organizing work, challenging the cages that divide us from fighting for justice with each other. My story is one of not only questioning, but of resistance, of slow, deliberate, and intentional organizing, and refusing to accept things as flat or one-dimensional. So hi, my name is Joshua Allen. I'm a Black, gender non-conforming abolitionist and organizer. My work is specifically focused around issues of gender, race, policing, and prisons. I identify politically as a disruption, a failure, and a misfit. For pretty much my entire life, I've been in spaces where I didn't quite fit, and I've consistently failed notions of gender, race, and age. It is through this failure that I have found my greatest successes. By failing to be masculine enough for some racial justice movements, I was able to draw connections between misogyny and the policing of Black masculine bodies. By failing to be trans enough for movements around transmisogyny, I could provide a new perspective on gender. I'm here to encourage the misfits, the weirdos, and the failures to do so continuously and unapologetically, to challenge one-dimensional understandings of anything, from success to violence and from gender to race. It is in those failures that we find our greatest organizing tools. So, in 2013, the name Ilan Nettles shook queer, trans, and gender nonconforming people all across New York. In the coming months, Ilan's story echoed in social justice movement spaces all across the US. And in late August, 2 years ago now, Ilan, a 21-year-old Black trans femme, was beaten to death in front of a police precinct in Harlem. Now, back in the summer of 2013, I was 17 years old and living in New York City. Like many young, trans, and gender nonconforming people of color, I was homeless and spending most of my time in between friends' places and housing sites for LGBT youth in Brooklyn. Attacks, disappearance, and murder weren't foreign concepts to me, but rather everyday realities. In fact, Ilan's story and experience felt all too familiar. Now, when I was 17, I was necessarily focused on survival. I didn't possess academic language or social theory with which to understand this feeling of familiarity, but through intentional political education, I began to understand these occurrences as connected to a larger project that had all to do with gender and race. So, for the past 6 years, nationwide trends have shown a consistent rise in anti-LGBT violence and murder according to the Anti-Violence Project's national report on hate violence against LGBTQ and HIV-affected communities. In the 6-year period, there has been a simultaneous rise in the visibility of LGBT people in the mainstream media, news, and entertainment. This increased visibility has sparked a now national discourse around non-normative identities. Now, with the rise in media attention, we've seen the birth of cultural productions such as the Gets Better Project and the proposed arrival of a transgender tipping point. There have also been several legislative pushes that have been successful, including but not limited to marriage equality and trans inclusion in the military. While the United States has been portrayed as growingly progressive around issues of gender and sexuality with these landmark occurrences, violence, death, and disease have been on a steady rise all the while. So, as I mentioned before, organizing around sexuality always felt too flat. Growing up queer in the US, you're first exposed to these neoliberal bastions of hope, right? Like the It Gets Better Project or the proposed arrival of the transgender tipping point. These floating pieces of the movement are enshrouded in positive ideas like hope, acceptance, and my favorite, tolerance. These ideas, while comforting, are wholly inadequate when confronting rising trends and violence. Another part of this flatness lies in the whitewashing of the LGBT movement, demonstrated largely by political efforts of representation in the mainstream media. So Liberation Theory 101 prescribes that movement work centers those who are most directly impacted by injustice. The fact that messages of tolerance dominate the national discourse, rather than a call for more resources, exposes the flawed logic of the LGBT agenda. So, a year after Ilan's murder, I was in college. I'd gained access to words like intersectionality that allowed my thoughts to function as currency rather than confusion. As opposed to an eerie feeling of familiarity around the death of trans and non-conforming people all around me, I understood death, disease, and violence as a byproduct of a structural and ongoing project. It became clear to me that a nuanced approach around organizing around my own lived experiences and those of people like me was growing increasingly necessary. Now, there was always an unspoken divide between LGBT and racial justice growing up. Now, it's unclear to me whether or not this divide has to do with racism, one-dimensional thinking, or a combination of both, but regardless, that divide always felt useless to me. While most of the organizing work I was doing in college had to do with racial justice and challenging the prison industrial complex, I realized that trans and gender nonconforming people, myself included, were severely impacted by racism in the prison industrial complex and are largely excluded from those movement spaces. Now I'd like to evoke the name of Maya Hall. On March 30th of this year, Maya Hall was shot to death for attempting to drive into the wrong part of an airport by a national security officer in Baltimore, Maryland. Maya Hall was a 27-year-old black trans femme. Now, while mainstream LGBT media will have you believe that the center of the LGBT movement is well-to-do, white, middle-class, same-sex couples, and racial justice movements will have you believe that the epicenter of all state violence is young black men, people like Maya Hall are actually profoundly more indicative of the crux of both movements. Maya Hall's story is particularly important because it was the biggest incident this year that we know of someone who deviated from normative gender being killed directly by an agent of the state. Maya Hall's story, however, is most likely not exclusive to her. People who deviate from normative gender are documented as and buried as the sex they're assigned at birth rather than their own self-determined genders. Now, gender nonconforming people are also at the epicenter of this violence. In a report published by the National Center of Transgender Equality in 2010, gender nonconforming people are more likely to be harassed by the police, assaulted by the police, and experience death by suicide than their trans and queer counterparts. The reality in the US today, and many places abroad, is that people who deviate from normative gender are susceptible to state and interpersonal violence at much higher levels than the rest of the population. So, stories of trans and gender nonconforming femmes being killed across the country have striking similarities with the murders of young black men that are plaguing the US now and that are part of the national discourse. The overwhelming majority of those who are killed or attacked because they deviate from normative gender go without punity or any other practice understood under the realm of justice. Mass amounts of murders and assaults happening in the US today without punity implies a sense of disposability for those who violence is being perpetuated against. The state seems to have no motivation to seek what it understands as justice for these individuals such as Maya Hall or any other black people who are murdered by the police or otherwise agents of the state. This lack of motivation is telling, but not necessarily all negative. Oftentimes, people dismiss calls for justice because they either assume the police to be above their own practices of punity or perpetuate the walls between LGBT and racial justice movements by emphasizing that a host of the murders against trans people or other black people is enacted by black men. This logic assumes that violence is a phenomenon that can be understood on an individual basis as opposed to within the context of greater societal conditions. So, taking into account the structural conditions within the US and how laws, moral standards, and pretty much all other forms of societal fabric are in fact handed down from the state, we must closely reevaluate the perceived autonomy of individuals when it pertains to interpersonal violence. Surely if police and lawmakers have enacted centuries of violence against black and indigenous communities in the US for centuries, we cannot understand violence committed interpersonally outside of that context. In the last year, it has become increasingly clear to me that the narrative of so-called black-on-black crime or black men killing black trans people actually proves to be a useless political framework with which to understand violence if discussed outside of a context that implicates the state. When using a historical analysis of state violence, it becomes apparent that both George Zimmerman, the unemployed man who killed Trayvon Martin, and the undiscovered killer of gender nonconforming Ashton O'Hara are not carrying out individual murders, but rather acting as a part of a larger ongoing project of state violence. So addressing these issues clearly requires going beyond and outside of the system, right? Angela Davis describes prison abolition as the practice of addressing societal injustices outside of the use of prisons. Scholars like Angela Davis and Michelle Alexander have named prisons as a clear continuation of slavery in the U.S. This is demonstrated by the grossly unjust pay wages of black women in prison, averaging around 30 cents a day for up to 12 hours of labor in some places. This speaks to the medical malpractice and experimentation on black bodies under the custody of prisons and jails. This is demonstrated by the rampant rise in private for-profit prisons and the increasing power in immigration, customs, and enforcement all across the nation, and of course, a host of other horrifying realities. Now, prison abolition can be practiced a number of ways. Personally, I understand the abolition of prisons as the creation of safety and security strategies originated by and oriented toward the community rather than the police. Oftentimes, people envision abolition as a project that feels too unrealistic or too radical. The question people normally first respond with is, well, what about the murderers? One of the most important things to note is that out of the 2.5 million people incarcerated in U.S. prisons and jails today, only 1% of those people are actually incarcerated for murder. Now, prison abolition doesn't propose that we ignore murder, but rather that we find new ways to prevent or address it. That includes, but of course is not limited to, investing in education, housing programs, after-school programs, the treatment of mental illness, understanding cognitive differences, aggressively working to end poverty, and efforts to end racism, sexism, and transphobia. Now, true practices of abolition imagines justice through a framework of transformation and restoration rather than punity. Say someone, let's call them Caden, steals from me because they don't have enough money to eat at night. What would a process of restoration as opposed to incarceration look like? What if instead of locking Caden in a cage for this, we could instead create employment opportunities that are sufficient enough for them to make enough money to not only eat, but to restore the money they originally stole from me? What if that process of restoration included having Caden work a few hours a week helping out a local farm, where they could develop skills around food production and work toward lessening the blow of hunger for impoverished people? Organizing from an abolitionist framework and moving away from the state to find solutions that its logic has created and perpetuated has been the key to liberation movements all across time. In our fights for gender and racial justice, we must rid ourselves of the constructed cages that surround not only our bodies, but most importantly, our minds. We must understand that moves toward freedom have always come from those most directly impacted by injustices, and that it would be wrong of us to discount that leadership. Most importantly, we must understand the tangible connections between our identities and our experiences and work to operate in solidarity with each other across movements to create practices that are robust enough to eradicate the walls of prisons, gender violence, and racism. So to bring this all together, questioning the utility of presidential candidates like Al Gore when I was younger pushed me to question the utility of presidents altogether. Questioning the gray area between man and woman pushed me to imagine a freer gender. Questioning the difference between murder and state violence pushed me to re-understand justice. And it is through consistently questioning that we build a world without cages. I'd like to close by offering words from a world-renowned abolitionist, Assata Shakur. I have been locked by the lawless, handcuffed by the haters, and gagged by the greedy. And if I know anything at all, it is that a wall is just a wall and nothing more at all. It can be broken down. I believe in living, I believe in birth, I believe in the sweat of love and in the fire of truth. And I believe that a lost ship, steered by tired seasick sailors, can still be guided home to port. Thank you.